You might watch and think, oh, I like Coca-Cola or like MasterCard. No one's going to buy a barrel of Saudi Arabian oil because they see it in the corner of a World Cup match. It's pure power, projection, geopolitics. It sort of washes the reputation of those countries, right? Fundamentally, if you sponsor one of the biggest teams in the world, Real Madrid or Manchester United or Inter Milan or whatever, that's a billboard that is being worn for free by people all over the world. There is no sport, there is no cultural phenomenon that is as popular around the world as football is.
The World Cup may be the world's biggest ad campaign. Looking at a sponsor's logo on a shirt, it really tells you something, right? Not just what companies have money and who's doing well, but more specifically, which industries are trying to look normal, beloved, or maybe even inevitable. And in that sense, soccer shirts are a surprisingly sharp way to read the world. In his book, More Than a Shirt, author, journalist Joey D'Orso looks at global politics, money, and power through 22 different soccer shirts. His argument is amazing. It's that shirts are not just shirts. They're movable billboards, national symbols, and actually compressed stories about companies that want visibility, legitimacy, and reputational adjacency. They are a form of history and a way to understand power. So let me tell you a little bit about Joey. He has written that he's obsessed with the topic, and he's spent the last few years traveling around the world investigating it. He's worked for the BBC, The Athletic, and The Times, and his book, More Than a Shirt, came out in June 2025. He also has a Substack newsletter. I loved reading his book. Joey, welcome to Policy Prompt. Let's get to shirts. The book is such an adventure and so well researched and sort of takes us through time and takes us to different places. I was really attracted to it because we talk about transformative technologies usually. And to think of a shirt, again, the static nature of a shirt, to think of a shirt as a transformative technology and just this vehicle for commentary about how the world is changing, I think is so savvy, and I appreciate it so much. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about when shirts as an organizing principle, how did that land?
Yeah, so the book is More Than a Shirt, How Football Shirts Explain Global Politics, Money and Power. And certainly football originated in England in the 1860s and is a very old sport, but it's only in the last few decades, really, that I think shirts have taken on this big kind of political, economic significance. I mean, the first shirt sponsor was in Germany. Actually, Jägermeister was on a sort of provincial team in Germany in about 1973. It wasn't really until the 1990s. Yeah. Do you guys have Jägermeister? You know what that is?
We do. You know what? I had in my notes that I thought one of the first sponsors was Hitachi, but you would know better than me because you wrote the book.
Hitachi was Liverpool. That was the first really big club in England to have one. But
okay.
This is quite obscure team in Germany had Jägermeister back in 73. There are sort of distant, dusty records that teams in South America might have had them in the 50s, but no one's quite sure. But it didn't really start rolling until the 80s and the 90s. It was the 90s that football started kind of really globalizing, big money pouring in England and all over Europe.
So it starts in the 80s and 90s, but then, the economy digitizes, and yet shirts stay a very kind of static form of consistent advertising. When a company or a jurisdiction is sponsoring a football shirt, what's the calculus, right? What are they accessing? Is it being seen, being associated with the players? Is it the fact that people purchase the shirts and then wear them, which is also a form of advertising? Is it a little bit all of the above? Maybe we could just set up why we see continued investment and sort of rivalrous investment too.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few reasons. I think at the early beginnings, it was very ad hoc. It would often be like a sort of local brewery just phone up the chairman and say, can we, it wasn't very strategic. Whereas more recently, these things are worth tens of millions of dollars. There's a huge investment from companies they think about very carefully. I mean, fundamentally, if you sponsor one of the biggest teams in the world, Real Madrid or Manchester United or Inter Milan or whatever, that's a billboard that is being worn for free by people all over the world. But it's, the early days, I think there was a very direct financial transaction. It was like you're selling a brand of beer or a food or telecommunications or something that people can buy. Whereas now it's often more political. It's Middle Eastern investment funds, it's Middle Eastern airlines, and they're not really advertising the airline necessarily. They're advertising the Middle Eastern country. Emirates, which sponsors Real Madrid, Arsenal, lots of other teams. I don't think Emirates is a legit airline that people use, but I think it's more about this sort of soft power geopolitics thing.
You mentioned era, and the book takes us through some eras, starting from the 70s, maybe this kind of casual, very sweet, informal, like the most kind of authentic and almost adorable layer of sponsorship, but then it kind of goes off to the races.
Yeah, that's right. And incredibly ad hoc. Aston Villa won the European Cup, now the Champions League in 1982, beaten Bayern Munich. And they had Davenport's Brewery, which was a local brewery on the shirt. Literally, they're probably just down the road, knew the chairman from... And then you'd think, they'd build on that and then get a... And 2 years later, there was no sponsor, and then there wasn't one for 3 years. It was incredibly ad hoc. There was no strategy. And that all started to change in the 90s. You get lots of Japanese electronics companies sponsoring English teams, Hitachi, Sharp, JBC, and a lot of kind of hardware. In Italy, it was like washing machines, these sort of... I think
amazing.
Relative to income, those things were much more expensive than they are now.
Yeah.
Like a TV is really cheap now. So that was a big one. And then in the 2000s, it became much more sort of globalized. The biggest teams weren't just advertising to their domestic market anymore. They were advertising to the world.
You hinted before when you brought up and I'm actually bad at pronouncing this word, the Jägermeister, the kind of local clubs, makes me think of almost like children's football or soccer teams, like the community center and stuff like that. And then you take us through the shift from local sponsors that more maybe reflect like nearby community or the geography of teams kind of more explicitly. And then that globalization shift and acceleration to international firms. And now sometimes even almost state sponsorship, right? Of shirts and the acquisition of teams, like the shifting ownership of teams, I think is an interesting parallel conversation in terms of geopolitics and private equity and ownership. Maybe could you take us through that arc a little bit more in terms of sponsorship growing?
Yeah, so I think, as I was saying earlier, the sport has it's 150 years old. Even in like North America, actually quite booming, certainly in the US and the northeast of the US. Before the Great Depression, there were big teams that had lots of fans, but then it all went wrong in the Great Depression. But it didn't really globalize, I would say, till the 90s. And the 1994 World Cup in the US was a huge turning point, which I think maybe people didn't realize at the time because it's not popular, or certainly wasn't popular then among the majority of the American public.
Really?
But from a commercial perspective, in 94?
Wait, in 1994, the World Cup wasn't popular?
It was well attended.
I don't know.
It was really well attended.
It was well attended, but not as much attention, you're saying, in North America.
But in the mainstream of American public opinion, there are like USA Today columns from the time being like, what is this stupid European game? It was seen as something for like, for women and children. There's a really interesting story about women's football, which took up much earlier than in Europe in the 1970s because of this Title 9 or 11, I've forgotten, thing signed by Ronald Reagan about equal access to the various facilities, which completely unintended consequences made colleges in the US invest loads of money in football because it was kind of cheap and easy to open up access, like compared to basketball or American football, as I would call it. These things require lots of resources and equipment. Whereas with football, soccer, you just need a pitch and like some shoes or a ball. So if you want to really rapidly expand access to women's sport, football was the way that happened in the US in the 1970s, which was an unintended consequence of this law signed by, not Reagan, Nixon. But then, the USA 94 was a huge commercial success because it's like we're seeing now with the World Cup in the US and Canada and Mexico, of course. The market is so big. The TV advertising is worth so much money. It's why the NFL is worth more money than European football, soccer leagues, even though far more people watch them because people are richer, basically, bluntly. Like Americans are a lot richer than Italians and Spanish people. And you have a country of 300 million people and there's just loads of money there. So 94 was this big moment where FIFA was kind of like, wow, this is where the money is. And I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but
it's okay.
But then football really started globalizing. And I think another really big factor is satellite television floating all around the world around the millennium. And you got, Africa, Asia, these tiny villages in rural Africa and Asia watching kind of European football for the first time. And then after that, you have the mobile internet. I was talking I spent some time in India, and you have tiny villages in India, which are by global levels kind of really impoverished, have very basic living conditions, sanitation facilities, but they're streaming Premier League, Champions League on their phones because it's so cheap now to stream mobile internet. So I think all these technological changes have massively changed things in the last 20 or 30 years and meant a sort of, I've spoken before about the kind of the ground war and the air war. Like football kind of did the ground war in South America 100 years ago, spread it to these cities, became this huge game. But the sort of air war of like reaching people by TV, by the internet has only happened really quite recently.
and now more streaming and kind of on demand? Are there football influencers? Like how is that
Yeah,
economy?
massive, absolutely
Massive,
massive.
right? Of course. Okay.
And a lot of thing that people kind of worry about is are now people consuming the game in this sort of TikTok clips, influencers, personalities, people shouting at each other rather than like sitting down to watch a game over 2 hours when a lot of it is quite boring, right? It could be 0-0, it could be 0-0, it could be, it's not like basketball, we have a point every 30 seconds. Like
Yeah.
football is like long periods of inactivity spiked by huge drama.
Oh
But
my
is
gosh.
that, you know,
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm just saying, oh my gosh, football and like the attention economy, I hadn't really considered, right? Like now you're making me think of like football and like film students who don't want to watch the whole movie or are kind of
Yeah.
attention crisis, but we can keep that as a tangent because that, that doesn't connect to shirts. And then how do fans react to some of that soft power and geopolitics? Does it matter? Like, does that calculus factor into maybe a football team's decision to accept or even court the partnership in the first place?
I mean, I think fans generally don't care that much or like pay too much attention. It's a brutal honesty, I think. But I think that's kind of one of the clever things about it is by taking, for example, like Emirates, which is the state airline of Dubai in the UAE, which is, an autocratic country in many ways. But by associating it with Real Madrid, the dominant team of European football, the Champions League of the last 10, 15 years, of Arsenal, one of the best supported teams in England, who are not only sponsored by Emirates, their stadium in London is called the Emirates Stadium. You sort of remove this brand name from the context of Dubai and from an oppressive government in all sorts of ways, something that gets a lot of criticism, to something completely different that feels very apolitical, which is one of the reasons I think nation states do it.
Is that what is referred to as sport washing?
Yeah. That's a term that comes up a lot, sports washing, absolutely.
Okay.
And I'm sure it's a term you're hearing a lot in Canada and the US coming up to the World Cup. I mean, sports washing has many forms. One is the sort of direct sponsorship. It's normally about nation states, right? So like Russia hosting the World Cup in 2018, Qatar hosting the World Cup in 2022, Emirates sponsoring top teams. It sort of washes the reputation of those countries, right? Mm-hmm. But I think particularly for Qatar, like the reason they do it is they're a tiny little country with opponents on all sides. And it kind of makes Qatar like harder to invade, right? It makes Qatar's existence more stable because you have lots of foreign money coming in. You have lots of foreign visitors flying in and out. It sort of knits you into the world economy in a way that almost nothing really does because there is no sport, there is no cultural phenomenon that is as popular around the world as football is.
We call it soccer, but that must be annoying
for
you to hear. It was like hard. I know. Don't worry. We totally get it.
And that's okay, and it's originally an English word, as many Americans have reminded me, the abbreviation of association football, soccer, and the English were using it before the Americans were. So yeah, no soccer shaming here.
Policy Prompt is produced by the Center for International Governance Innovation. CG is a nonpartisan think tank based in Waterloo, Canada, with an international network of fellows, experts, and contributors. CG tackles the governance challenges and opportunities of data and digital technologies, including AI, and their impact on the economy, security, democracy, and ultimately our societies. Learn more at cgonline.org.
The book tackles the online gambling boom as well. And, we noted that the Premier League has now banned gambling sponsors on the front of shirts. That's going to start in 2026 or maybe next year. That seems like a pretty big deal. So if football is kind of the world's biggest ad campaign, what happens when the ad category is kind of a form of addiction? Like, how should we think about or start to reconcile the fact that it was normal for online gambling to be sort of elevated through the sport?
Yeah, and I don't know the situation of the laws in Canada, but I do in the US, and that it's growing incredibly quickly. And I've just spent some time in Brazil, which is similar. It's absolutely booming. It's everywhere. But it's kind of interesting from a British perspective because the UK was kind of patient zero. It massively liberalized its gambling laws in January 2007, which completely unknowingly was a few months before the first iPhone came out and changed gambling forever. Like online gambling then was like, nerdy men in their bedrooms with big desktop computers. And now it's like in everyone's pocket. And in the UK, it's kind of been on a journey where now gambling is seen as like, certainly not glamorous, online gambling. It's seen as a social problem, social harm. It's incredibly ubiquitous. And the authorities are sort of slowly clamping down on it more and more, but it's everywhere.
In Canada too, we're not there. We've like normalized the market and we're capturing value from it. So I think that's the bigger tension for Canada in a way. But so sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I've spent time in the US a couple of years ago, and I was really struck by the conversation around it. The way it looks on TV is like glamorous. It's exciting. There's none of this kind of, if the fun stops, stop. This is actually linked to loads of social problems. But I think that will come down the track in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
I think about gambling addiction that makes it very different from, say, alcohol or drug addiction is you can't see it in someone necessarily. If your loved one or, friend is addicted to alcohol or drugs, you would probably realize pretty quickly. Whereas if they're constantly, on their phone at home betting, you might not never know until they have some huge mental health crisis or something.
And what about the phenomenon of Chinese gambling sponsors being on, English league shirts, where maybe it seems like in the immediate audience, there's no market, but these companies are still kind of taking some of the most sought after sponsorship spots. Should we think of that as more of a sport washing, normalization, advertising element, or?
Well, it's really shady. And it's something I've done a lot of work on over the years. Basically, gambling is massive in China. It's culturally massive. Sort of in the home, little games for cards, for money, much more so than in Europe or North America. But gambling companies are illegal. They're banned. But Chinese people like watching Premier League or European football. And the way they advertise is companies will advertise on the billboards in stadiums in England or on shirts in stadiums in England, circumventing any Chinese ban. But these companies are complete kind of shadows. They're impossible to find out who runs them. They're often based in Vietnam and the Philippines. And through a lot of work that I've done and other people have done, I've basically realized that lots of these companies are linked to incredibly shady organizations, linked to human trafficking, really serious crime, money laundering. Where gambling is illegal, you often have to scratch hard at the surface to find organized crime, right? For all sorts of reasons. And that is clearly some organizations like this were sponsoring top level football clubs in England for many years.
And then again, you said earlier that for the average person or even the average fan, there's not maybe as much scrutiny or attention on the politic of the sponsor. Do you see that changing? Are there hints of that to create kind of more of a maybe consumer or crowd pressure on the future of these advertising kind of slots and logos?
I mean, a bit. I think Germany is an interesting example because Germany has a much more political fan culture, certainly than in England or in Italy or Spain or any of the other big European countries. So we've seen it a bit in Germany. There's an interesting one recently in England with Arsenal and Visit Rwanda, the tourism board for the nation of Rwanda, which has been linked to all sorts of human rights abuses recently in the Congo. And they sort of quietly cancelled that quite recently. There's quite a lot of criticism of it. But I think, I'm always quite careful not to be I never want to be sort of hectoring or sort of telling people that they should be enjoying this sport. And sort of, the sort of day-to-day being a fan should be this sort of fraught and anxious political thing, because I think people do view sport as escapism. And if you sort of push it too hard, you sort of turn people off that conversation. But I think there are some particularly egregious examples like Newcastle United being owned by the state of Saudi Arabia or the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, which I think is just so blatant and so obnoxious that I think that should be kind of called out.
So maybe there's not as much awareness, and thank you for pointing to that ownership again. Do you think that fans sort of maybe just see it as the cost of the business of sport? Like people are willing to sort of discount or not offer that scrutiny or sort of that double click, or even that it's a more passive consumption of, say, the Visit Rwanda campaign or the cryptocurrency or OpenAI. I guess I'm grabbing at examples actually that are like advertising during the Super Bowl, which I think has like a tangent here in terms of like bubbles and peaks and valleys in a way. I'm not even asking you a question. I'm just speculating. So sorry.
No, well, there was the crypto bowl about 3 years ago, which was when the Super Bowl, it was like Larry David was on one, and it was absurd. Yeah. And the whole thing is like embarrassing for everyone concerned now.
No, totally. And I think that's an interesting parallel in terms of when we're watching sports and those major games, sort of what's the complementary advertising that's happening around that. And maybe we're more aware of that as an ecosystem. Let's do a little bit more case studies. This is going to be more, I guess, some of your greatest hits. So feels hopefully not too redundant for you, but how did the murdered leader of a drug cartel wind up on a football jersey?
Yeah, so that's a pretty crazy story from Colombia, from Medellin in Colombia, which not that long ago, sort of we're talking the 90s, was the most dangerous place in the world. People were gunned down, the drug cartels, the cocaine, Pablo Escobar, and this guy became incredibly rich, sort of getting cocaine from the coca leaves of rural Colombia, turning them into this powder, which then went crazy in New York and Miami and then all over the world. And a few people got incredibly rich, and it was incredibly violent. And people were just gunning each other down over tiny sums of money. The Americans sort of took a great interest in this and ended up killing him in Medellin in 1993. And after that, things kind of scattered a bit. It was complicated. There were rivals vying for power. And one offshoot was the Envigado cartel in a place called Envigado, which is actually where Escobar's political career began. And it's known for football. James Rodriguez, who is the most famous Colombian footballer of modern times, he started there. But this club was owned by a drug cartel called the Envigado cartel. And the guy who ran it was murdered in 2006, but his son, as a loving gesture to his father, put his silhouette of his father on the back of the shirt. So these players running around with a murdered drug gangster on the back of their shirts. And this club was eventually sanctioned by the US government. It was put on the Clinton list, which is a list that originated in the 90s under Clinton of sanctioned entities all over the world. And one was this football club. So for a while, they played with no sponsors at all because no, soft drink companies, alcohol companies in Colombia that typically sponsor clubs, they didn't want to go anywhere near them because dealing with a sanctioned entity makes your life very hard. It means you can't deal with American banks and all sorts of things. So for this period around the sort of early 2010s, they had no sponsor at all and a dead gangster's face on the back, which is just a sort of quite obscure story from Colombian politics and history, but I think a kind of amazing one that tells these much bigger stories because football was such a big part of the cartels in the 80s, and Atlético Nacional was Escobar's team. He had at La Catedral, have you seen the Narcos on Netflix? La Catedral was his sort of open prison outside Medellin where he had incredibly luxurious and lavish kind of parties there, and Diego Maradona came to visit and all these things. It wasn't really a prison, but football was such a huge part of this kind of prestige of that. And I think all over the world you see shady people, frankly, whether they be outright criminals or political leaders, using football as a vehicle to not necessarily make money, actually to lose money, to spend money, but to make themselves feel important, to make themselves kind of cool and glamorous, right? It's a good place to kind of host business contacts. And so that a lot of that went on in Colombia in the 80s and 90s. Your
book has 22 shirts. Was there a 23rd or like a shirt you wish you maybe snuck in or that has come up in some of your supplementary research or that didn't make the cut that we can give you an opportunity to touch on a little bit?
Well, there's certainly, I didn't go to South America. Well, I went to Colombia, but Brazil, Argentina have always just completely fascinated me, and Uruguay. I'm actually in Uruguay at the moment, and I'm working on a new project, which I can't say too much about now, but it involves going to lots of football in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. I mean, I think, those countries I didn't speak as much about as I would like, and that's for kind of future. But Buenos Aires, I think, is like the biggest football city in the world. And interestingly, a sort of globalized club like Boca Juniors has been sponsored by like Pepsi and BBVA Bank. An interesting example of international brands seeking out a club beyond Europe, which is quite unusual, I think.
With the World Cup coming up, I mean, for Canada, the World Cup feels more, there's this overt like geopolitical undercurrent for us, but let's put that aside. What should we be looking for, thinking about in terms of sponsorship and advertising and how all of this has evolved? Because I mean, we've got the anchor of the shirts and teams. You've mentioned advertising within stadiums, which is also evolving and digitizing. And then there's the layer of sponsoring individuals or having, ads when we're watching on television if we're not streaming something. But maybe we could just start to look ahead to that event and the politics of advertising, both directly and indirectly.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about international football is that the shirts don't have any sponsors, and they never have done. But the reason for that isn't some sort of noble ideal. It's because FIFA have their own sponsors and on the billboards of every stadium, and they don't want to be competing for that with the shirts. But you have huge top global brands like Coca-Cola, Visa or MasterCard. But you also have Saudi Aramco, the Saudi state oil company, who basically bankrolled the recent Club World Cup in the US. Mm-hmm. It was a bizarre sort of circular thing of the Club World Cup needed money. Yeah. DAZN, the media company, needed to be paid for its rights that was streamed for free. And Saudi Aramco wanted its advert everywhere. So it was this sort of triangle where $1 billion changed hands like weeks before the tournament started. And Saudi Arabia, $1 billion, that's no big deal. So you'll see the Saudi state oil company. But the weird thing about that, right, is, you might watch and think, oh, I'd like Coca-Cola or like MasterCard. No one's going to buy a barrel of Saudi Arabian oil because they see it in the corner of a World Cup match. It's pure power projection geopolitics.
Speak for yourself, Joey. Yeah, speak for yourself.
Can you even buy a barrel of oil? I've got no idea. Maybe you can. But
are there firms or states that you are anticipating might become future sponsors? Like, is there an element to your ongoing analysis as a fan, as an analyst, as an expert that you sort of have on your mood board?
Football often just reflects broader economic, political changes, often a year or two later, like crypto. But then, AI, that's where the biggest companies in the world now, that's where so much business energy and money is. So I would, not be surprised if we see some big AI companies sponsoring or even owning clubs pretty quickly. As for nation states, well, it tends to be authoritarian countries with lots of oil because they can afford to splash it around. In democracies, that's what, in places like the US or Canada or the UK, where you have lots of stadiums, you can host an event pretty cheaply, but things get controversial in democracies that don't have great infrastructure. Morocco is hosting the World Cup in 2030 with Spain and Portugal. And it's been really controversial in Morocco. There's been big protests, right? Because of public money going to stadiums, not to, healthcare and education and whatever else. We saw very similar things in Brazil in 2014. And it's easier. You're Qatar. You don't have a voting public. You just build a stadium, So that's why I think a lot more energy in football is flowing towards these kind of countries, Azerbaijan,
Do you wear football jerseys casually in everyday life? Like, is this part of your experience as a fan? And do you have a favorite one? Because we were kind of curious.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of Aston Villa in England. Yeah, they have one which I write about in the book, which they're sponsored by Acorns, which is a children's hospice, for like dying children, like looking after them in there, which is a wonderful cause and one that I was kind of quite aware of as a kid growing up in the same area. It was often like, people would raise money for it. And that was on the shirt for 3 years, not that long ago, like 2008 to 2010. Mm-hmm. And the chairman just wanted to do it as a nice gesture. The American guy, Randy Lerner, who also sponsored the Cleveland Browns. But it's kind of a no-brainer now. Like, no one would do that anymore because you're just leaving money on the table. Like, you're leaving $20-30 million that could be a dodgy gambling firm. So it was kind of nice, but also the an end of an era where that would even ever happen.
Yeah.
And we also saw Barcelona, who had UNICEF on their shirts for years. But that is over. And you kind of like, it's just leaving so much money on the table and there'll be such a tangible decline in your team's performance that like no one does it anymore. There's just too much financial pressure.
And then you had also mentioned like Pepsi and Coca-Cola. What do you think is so persistent about these like conglomerate drinks and how that hasn't changed sort of since the 90s in terms of this like perennial sports advertising? Or I'm thinking of like the Pepsi advertisements and like the Super Bowl and things like that too. Or could be Coca-Cola. Obviously the ads aren't working on me. I can't differentiate them. Are we going to ever get away from fountain drinks?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those unusual products that is kind of sold in every country in the world and popular in every country in the world. There's not much like that, which I guess explains it. And sort of a real sort of what's the word? Not monopoly, but biopoly. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Like just
duopoly.
Duopoly. That's it. Duopoly.
Yeah.
There's not really anyone else. So it's like Pepsi is probably directly taking market share from Coca-Cola and they're sort of incentivized to throw loads of cash at it because if they don't, they'll split behind. But yeah, you see Pepsi and Coca-Cola everywhere in South America, like one or the other.
Yeah.
As you do all over the world.
And I suppose Red Bull popping up more and more in some sporting elements.
Well, Red Bull's interesting because that owns a lot of clubs. It owns Red Bull Leipzig in Germany was the first. Salzburg in Austria was the first, then Red Bull Leipzig. They own Bragantino in Brazil. They own a big share of Leeds United in England. Red Bull, New York Red Bulls. I've been to their stadium actually in New Jersey. Yeah, that's quite different to Coca-Cola and Pepsi. That's a sporting ownership model. Mm-hmm. But it's all about advertising soft drinks, right? Like, that's why they own these clubs. That's their ultimate goal is to sell energy drinks.
At the end of the day, that is their goal, not necessarily ours. You reminded us that there's so much more to the shirts that we're going to see when we watch soccer, when we watch football, and when we're thinking about sporting events writ large. Thank you for everything you put into the book, and we're looking forward to your next project and wish you the best with it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joey.
Policy Prompt is produced by me, Vass Bednar, and CG's Paul Sampson. Our supervising producer is Tim Lewis, with technical production by Henry Damon and Luke McKee. Show notes are prepared by Lynn Schellenberg. Social media engagement by Isabel Neufeld. Brand design and episode artwork by Abhilasha Dewan and Sami Chowdhury, with creative direction from Sam Soy. The original theme music is by Josh Snethlaga. Please subscribe and rate Policy Prompt wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay tuned for future episodes.